jump to YouTube and I'll check if that's gone live. It started going live, and I can say hello distance students. So the distance students should be able to see me. Now I'm supposedly Runa at the moment, because he's interviewing a candidate to replace me. So I'm replacing him while he finds a way of replacing me. We're going to be talking games for education today. Now, I had intended, and I thought I had put out an announcement last week for this, but it is just buried in the information thing, so I sent out a new announcement. Yes?
I would update the title because it's professional programming now.
Oh, that's a good point. Let's change the title. 4307 Serious Games for Education in a 154. That's right. That's because I've got to go to settings and change my hotkeys and make sure I have no hotkeys. Oh no, I don't have any hotkeys. I must have just pressed something odd. Okay, so I've got the stream running. I've got you guys here. We'll go through some of the lecture content from Runa. This was from some of the stuff he presented last year. We've changed up a couple of the papers, so I've left those out of the presentation, right? Because I hadn't expected you guys to read any of those. And we'll go through some learning theory, and some of these papers include learning theory, which, if you're looking at serious games, the challenge is that you have to make good games and you have to make good education for games for education, right? And that can be tricky, right? Because it's hard to make good games and it's hard to make good educational content, and so you're kind of multiplying hard by hard with different requirements. And so you would expect most games for education to be bad. Right? In fact, that's what you find when you go out and look for games for education. Almost all of them are bad games. Right? They're just bad games. And so what we do is we say, okay, can we analyze why they're not very good games? And what are the ways we make them better? We also have to realize that we are competing against existing educational content. Now, there's a lot of existing educational content which is really, really low quality, right? So hard, like it's not well presented. It is taught badly. It is taught by people who, certainly as you get higher levels, who may not have been taught how people learn. Right? Because if you think of the normal PhD process, the normal way of becoming a lecturer, right, is that you do your undergraduate, you do your master's, you do your PhD in your research field, you do a bit of lecturing, and then you become a lecturer. We then, NTNU requires our staff to do a course on education, but those courses are mostly about, how do I put this? Not being a bad lecturer, right? They're not really about being a great lecturer. They're just encouraging you to not be terrible.
That whole system in general is badly designed because you don't sort of like, as a lecturer, or when you work at the university, you have to lecture, right?
Yes.
You also have to write reports.
Yes.
So that basically means that, you have the people who love doing science.
Yes.
Which then hate lecturing, but are forced to lecturing, so they're doing it badly.
Yes.
And then the guys who want to lecture but don't want to do research, they don't show up. Or they do bad research but do awesome lecturing.
Yes.
Obviously, since they do bad research, they're shit. So
They don't get promoted, and they don't have a career path. So we are trying to change that, right? So the university has introduced awards for quality teaching, right? To try and encourage people to be better lecturers. There's also a new pathway. Instead of having just professor, which is kind of research position, they've kind of reinstated docent, which is the career path from first elector, right, which is kind of high quality lecturing, into docent, which is a teaching position of quality. Part of my issue with that system is that I, as an associate professor, can't be promoted into docent because I'm on the research track rather than the teaching track. So I've already been pigeonholed into what I do. So we have a lot of issues with teaching quality. So when we're making serious games for education, as I said, we're competing against other educational systems. We also have to understand more about education. So one of the things we're doing, and one of the things we're doing this week, and the papers are focused on education and education styles. And we're also looking, hopefully, at some of your learning styles, and we'll discuss your particular learning styles and have a look at this discussion and debate about how you guys learn stuff and what's important to know. So we'll start with some old theory on zone of proximal development. Okay, so as you see, this is 1978, right? So well before any of you were born. I'm assuming none of you are pre-78. You don't. If you are, you've weathered extremely well. You all look remarkably young for being in your 40s. But so this was done in 78, and what it was looking at is how we build our knowledge. So the zone of proximal development idea is this distance between the actual development level, as determined by independent problem solving, and the level of potential development, as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Okay, so this idea was that, you know, while you're studying, right, there is your ability when we take you out and like just test you at where you currently are. But there's this kind of halo around your knowledge, this zone, which you would be capable of working in if someone was able to help you, either a teacher or a peer who was in that zone, right? Now, if the teacher is poor, they're outside that zone, right? So the cannot do at present. So the can do unaided and the cannot do, if you put yourself, so if you're a first year and you go in with a group of third year students on a project, it may be that your coding is so poor that there is no value in working with them because the concepts they're working on and the level they're at is just so far away from what you're capable of doing that you just can't move into that zone, right? So it's better to potentially work with second year students who are kind of one step ahead of you rather than two steps, right? So so that was the concept. And what it says is that when presenting challenges to students to make them develop, you should be putting those challenges in that yellow zone, right? In that kind of zone of proximal development. And there's also, he says in the quote there, all collaboration with more capable peers. He also talks about peers who might be less capable in some areas than you, but more capable in other areas. So by putting a group of people with diverse abilities, they can all lift each other up.
That's kind of interesting because that's how I've been approaching the previous bachelor. Also, it's like I'm going to try to group up with one person that is better at me in some courses and one person that was worse than me in some courses, but better in other courses.
Yep.
Just so we could sort of synergize.
And so you were kind of instinctually going for this zone of development approach, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? It makes sense that you can only learn things that are within they're built on things you know and within the zone. And so this also linked with previous ideas, and you'll hear the word scaffolding in educational theory quite a bit. So consists essentially of the adult controlling those elements of the task that are essentially beyond the learner's capability, thus permitting him/her to concentrate upon and complete only those elements that are within range of competence. Right? So basically saying, as a teacher, provide the framework that lets your students move through that zone. Right? Now, games do this particularly well, right? Because they're usually presenting you with a challenge that is an incremental challenge, right? Now, I just for humour's sake, and I have this example of a 2D game that Jason pointed me to, where it's fairly clear that this is not done in a way to help people out. So I'll add this to the stream in just a sec. Right. So if we click, I don't know if any of you seen this. Okay, some of you have seen this. So I need to now that interestingly, for the people on the stream, Chrome won't stream by window to OBS. Firefox will. So if I move to Firefox, and right, and I pause that. So this game looks like a standard add window. No, I need to go to add window capture. Aha. Okay, so on the stream, you see that this is a what looks like a standard 2D game, and so dancing, and oh yeah, standard jumping, hopping, jumping. Oh, that was mean. Okay, fair enough. Okay, I can and back and oh. Okay, now, so I know it's coming, so I go back, and then I jump back. Oh, it still follows me. Right, okay, so I'm going to have to go up there, jump back, jump back, jump back. Okay, jump, jump. Oh. So, jump, over. Now what do I do? Oh, while I wait, you slide me down into the thing. Okay, so, jump, through, jump. Oh, good. Okay.
Feels like more than
You waited too long, I'll slam you as well. Okay, so, what do I do here? Okay, goes there. What happens when I jump? Up. Okay, now this is quite clever, but not quite good enough. So, gonna try that again, and hey! So at each stage, he's making development. Now, this could be, and this player is a very, very determined player, right? As Jason said, he would have rage quit by this point. So, now, that is punishing them, hiding a thing, and then punishing them at each stage. This is not what I would consider a productive way of educating somebody, right? As every time they make some progress, you slam them with something hard. So scaffolding, you could argue that was an example of scaffolding, right? Because, you know, once you got through one task, it then gave you another task that was hard. But that's the evil way of doing scaffolding, right? That's by successive punishment rather than successive reward, right? So there are more than one way of doing scaffolding. That's the wrong way of doing scaffolding. The concept that games usually do, which is they present a new challenge, you then try that challenge until you get good at it, and then you can move on, right? It's not that you get good at the challenge and they punish you for succeeding. That's usually not the way of doing good scaffolding. So, can the concept of levels in games be related to zones of proximal? What do you think? Are levels the same as zones of proximal development? And what are the differences between that? So, what's the role of the teacher or the more accomplished peer? Or are you doing this unaided? Is it not? Is it just in the blue at the bottom?
Well, the scaffolding is of how what the game has taught you up to this point.
So how did?
Yes.
So, what's the scaffolding system? Can you think of other systems around games that might be providing this?
Well, one obvious one, if you're doing multiplayer, then the other teammates might be your peers that are sort of one step above. I think Journey did that. After you completed the game, you sort of started helping out others.
Yes, Journey had it very explicitly. Does this happen in other contexts in games? The one that was an explicit continuation, that you meant it.
Walkthroughs?
Walkthroughs, yes, that's a good example of scaffolding. Someone who is more competent, knows already how to do the level. Difficulty level, having a difficulty level structure allows you to have things that are more challenging. Though, you've still got to work out who's being the more competent peer at that point.
Also, like we did in some of the Mario games, where actually if you die enough times, they will play through it for you.
Yes.
So sort of like actual walkthrough.
A very explicit in-game, the game knows that this will help. So basically any kind of tutorial system you could in games. Onboarding is often what we talk about in games. Could be considered this kind of zone of proximal development. What disadvantages may scaffolding have in computer games?
Appreciate a sort of special frame of mind, so that you won't necessarily being creative if you just give them the solutions. So you're not necessarily trying. So you're playing the game the way it's meant to be played, which isn't necessarily the optimal.
There's an interesting word there, optimal. Yeah, the optimal way. So what you're saying is that to some extent, because you're being scaffolded, you are just following along the intended path.
Yeah, that sort of depends on how much you are allowing yourself to be, led from one part to the other.
So do you guys prefer really explicit tutorials or are kind of more implicit? Or what are your thoughts on tutorials?
It depends on if I'm playing a quite linear shooting game, for instance, I would prefer a more explicit way, because I feel like those games are intended to play in one way. You don't. I struggle to find multiple ways of playing it. The only thing is which weapon do I want to use now? But if I'm more of a exploratory game or a stealth game or a game where I have multiple opportunities, I would rather have, I want a tutorial that makes me think about what I want to do, rather than tell you that you can do it this way and this way and this way and this way.
Right. So depending on the experience, depends on how much scaffolding you would like to take you in the direction that the designer intended or the game experience intends, right? Because I suppose to some extent, visually you could imagine, therefore, if you imagine a zone of proximal development as a sphere, you could say the scaffolding is being built on one direction, and so it's taking you in that path. Now, if there basically is only one direction because the game experience dictates that, then it makes sense. But if it's an exploratory game where you should be exploring and trying different things, then the amount of scaffolding... you could do scaffolding in every direction, right? That might take a lot of work, because... what was the Scribblenauts? Yes. So Scribblenauts, most players believed that the content was being generated procedurally. Apparently it wasn't. Apparently it was generated by hand. Every type of item was explicitly drawn. And they just spent massive amounts of man hours drawing everything they could possibly think that you might want to possibly draw.
The combinations were drawn, like the attachments.
I don't know if every attachment was drawn. Everything, yeah, all the base stuff that you could possibly draw, they tried to work out how, like, all the things you could draw. They weren't generating those drawings from your drawing, they were matching it into a preset base, which is ridiculous given the number of things you could draw, right? So, yeah, they basically scaffolded in every direction, which was just an enormous amount of work. Education versus games. Scaffolding and education. So I assume that when you went through school, you could see scaffolding happening. Your teachers tried to present you things in edible chunks. So I think it's either Plato or Aristotle, I forget now, talked about carving the world at its joints. Right? So the idea is if you take knowledge, and you know when you carve up an animal, you carve it at the joints because that's the bit, because they're not having it cut through bone. Right? The idea is there are natural joints in knowledge. Sometimes they'll called threshold concepts, where it's easier to cut the world into those chunks. And so this idea of scaffolding is you carve it up into chunks. Did you think education was better at this than games, or do you find games better at it than education? What's your thought?
Games are way better.
Generally, games are way better? Would you say that game I just showed you was way better?
Sure.
you think that was actually better than most of your education?
A lot of it, yeah.
Right. So, what is game? Is there something about this proximal development thing that you think games are doing better, or is it they just is it a different aspect that they're better at?
I think, for instance, since during education you are part of a bigger group, so it's harder to make individual proximal. Let's look at the individual proximal zones. So,
Right.
So because what I learned during my childhood school was that I really liked math. So I was in the top of the class in math. So no math that was presented to me was challenging.
So basically it was all in the blue of the stuff I can already do zone.
While my English was terrible. I was one of the worst in English.
Right.
So, and I didn't really get much help in school to do that. So no matter how much help I got, I was outside my proximity zone.
Right, so basically you were in blue for math and red for language, and they weren't able to find a way of getting the red down into yellow to actually get you moving forward, and they couldn't give you enough in the math to get you into yellow to get you progressing forward. Is that familiar experience for most of you? For you, yes, and for you? Other people, did school work, like were you in the yellow most of the time at school? In that zone?
Either in red or in blue.
You were mostly red or blue?
Yeah.
What about the rest of the students? Christopher?
I was in both the red and the blue zone in some subjects, I think.
Mahesh?
Same for me, like for theory classes mostly. It's really difficult for me to understand.
Right.
And for technical and mathematics, it's easier for me to.
So who felt that they were mostly in the yellow at school? Excellent. That's good. And who felt they were more often on either red or blue? Okay, so we've got about a 50-50 mix, right? So here, education seemed to work for about half the class, right? Now, if you imagine that we were a bell curve, right? People in the middle of the bell curve sounds about right, right? So the 50% in the middle of the bell curve, if you target education at them, if you teach them, that's fine. People at the top end, the bottom end, well, you know, they're either too bright or too slow, and so we can't teach them, right? Now, that creates problems when you want everybody to move at the same pace, right? And that's often the challenge, is they wanted everybody to move at the same pace, and so they set up the same scaffolding in the same yellow zone for everybody, right? So there's a bunch of people who, in the bell curve, might have been at either end, and so weren't necessarily just in the middle, right? I would say most of you are actually at the, nearer the top end of the bell curve just in general, because you've ended up at master's level. And so even within you, there will be a distribution, and you'll be better at some things and not at others, and for some of you, you will be pretty good across a range of activities, and so you've been able to find that yellow zone for most of your education. It's one of the challenges as a lecturer when I'm teaching to a class, is you tend to teach to the centre of a class. So, for example, this year in the mobile course, we had the second years and the third years in the same class. And so Marish found it very difficult because the third years are all craving more because they've already done second year, and so they're further advanced. And all the second years are doing the, well, this is too hard for us. So finding that yellow zone when you're combining two different years is very difficult, right, to get one yellow zone. Then you start, there's a new concept called balance labs, where you try and provide challenge according to a pre-test. You give people a pre-test before they start, and then you give them challenge according to where they're currently at. Which is great and all, but then when you finish the course, how do you assess it? Do you assess it on the delta? Like, how much through the yellow zone you got? And how much you changed? Or by your end goal? Because those two things are different at that point, right? Because if you say, well, we're going to make topics easier for these students who have a low pretest, if they learn a lot during the course, but only get up to the bottom of the good students, are they only going to get a C? Although they learned a massive amount, they still only got to where they should have been starting the course at. And so only the people who already had done material beforehand had already... So for me, coming to university, I was programming since the age of 10. So as a programmer, I was already very good when I got to first year. So should only people who have already studied it be allowed to get the top grades?
It's sort of like the same problem as in that you can't give grades on how much people are working. Or not how much they're working, but like how intent they are on trying to actually get stuff working. Because that is something I feel should be, at least not necessarily affecting the grade you get at the end, but it should be sort of commended. Like I had this girl who I was studying with at my last university college. Like, I've never seen someone work that much.
Right.
She continuously got like these.
Right, an A for effort.
Yeah, like, no, you should.
Yep.
Because, you know, that's for employment, having someone that actually works continuously with something and knows what it means to actually strive for a goal, I would actually value that quite a lot.
So this brings us to another topic on education and grading that talks about, can you compact all of the variation that's going on in learning into a single number and then use that number as your quality? Right? So at the moment that tends to be what we do in grading, right? We give you an A. This is why I created the professional programming course in third year here in my bachelor degree, is because it annoyed me that we were compacting all of students' code and report writing into a single thing that was a single bachelor grade, right? Which meant you couldn't differentiate good programmers from good report writers because we're just combining everything and giving you one grade, right? I wanted to have more flexibility, so I created a new course so I could do that. Is there an example of games doing that?
There are games giving a different score based on different criteria.
There are games that give you different scores and different criteria. What else do games do to have a difference between different types of achievement? surely you guys have used Steam. Achievements and badges and, you know, things you've done in a game that aren't just about the score or just about which level you got to. Even mobile games. Is the level that you've got through the game the only measure? No, they also give you stars for how well you achieved in a particular level. Those are kind of two independent measures. One is how far you've progressed, because each time you pass the level, doesn't matter if you got 1 star or 3 stars, you still move forward. And then there's a separate measure of how well you did each level. And sometimes then combine those to say, well, yes, we've got this another achievement for getting 3 stars on every level in this block.
And then you subcategorize it so that you get like 1 achievement for doing the least number of parts and 1 for doing as fast as possible.
Yes. And so you create different ways to achieve, and you measure different things. Right? So you can imagine if this was in like the zones of proximal development, if you found someone who has a very narrow yellow band and can't, you're finding it very difficult to give them something where they can progress. You give them something else to do where they can progress in this other area. Right? So that they're not locked and stopped and blocked because the path you've said this is the only thing we value. Right? There are other things to value. So, and this brings us into learning styles. Are there different? So that's are you a speedrunner? Do you like doing different things in your game? Are you trying to achieve different things in different directions? This brings us into the idea of learning styles, and there are lots of discussion on learning styles. If you look up educational theory, you may find a discussion on learning styles debunked. If any of you do a Google, you'll probably be able to Google for learning styles debunked and find a whole bunch of discussion of saying, oh, learning styles are irrelevant and completely debunked, and it's pointless to talk about it.
They say the same about pedagogy, that you're not supposed to like do anything. You're supposed to tell people to play the text, I guess.
Right? You're supposed to just tell you to learn.
Yeah, which too many people say that each time the school debate comes up. Yeah, there's too much, pedagogical discussions going on. Like, it's shit that the school focuses too much on trying to find out how do you teach people.
Yeah, we spend too much time thinking. We should be spending more time doing and not thinking about what we do. Which would be, I would think, losing reflection. So, in games, we're reasonably comfortable. We talked about this last week. We talked about play styles, right? And we talked about Bartle had play types, and there were lots of these ideas that there are different motivations, and people have different levels of motivations in different areas, right? And that certainly intuitively has a bunch of value. Do you guys agree with that there are different play styles? Does anybody feel that you all play the same way? Because I'd be willing to have that debate, because it's an interesting debate, because you could just say it's all the same. It's just at either different levels, or it's not. There isn't a clear distinction between things, right? So one argument against this is are things like saying, well, although you could find those 4 types, if there are people evenly distributed across the whole framework, then those 4 types don't really mean anything, because they're just an artificial placement. It'd be like grouping people by last name. Doesn't really mean anything. It just means, well, it's just a way of grouping people. It doesn't say anything about your character, right? Unless you believe in nominal determinism. Do any of you believe in? You know what nominal determinism is? Your name dictates what job you'll have or what you'll do. So, Simons all end up being polishers or something, right? And if you're named Fletcher, you'll make bows for a living. Because that's what Fletchers used to do. But, so there was this idea that if we give you a particular name, right? So when you name your children, you are determining what life they'll have by the name you give them, right? Which is an interesting approach to thinking how reality works. But so some people say learning styles are the same way, right? yes, you can break people up like this, but it doesn't mean anything. Right? There isn't anything underneath. So, that said, we can look at some of these learning styles. So, one of the famous ones is Kolb's learning styles. And again, we need to think, is this a realistic breakdown of human beings that is interesting to apply, or is it just categorizing by, you know, height, or by eye color, or by name? So, this creates, again, copyrighted, David Kolb. So it is concrete and experience-based, right? So here you do think that, so you're looking for concrete experiences, right? So you're wanting to see how things feel, right? So what you do is you don't theorize them out, you go out and do stuff and experience it and see what it feels like. You have a reflection, observing, and watching phase, where you prefer to watch other people do, observe what they do, learn from what they do before you attempt it. Right? So rather than just jump in there and do it. There is an abstract thinking and conceptualization, where, having observed people, you would sit back, kind of internalize that, visualize things yourself, work through the abstract things that needed to be achieved before you progressed. And then there's the active experience, the doing, where you go in there and you try a particular thing to see if it works. So you're experimenting on the thing, right? So the difference between concrete experience and active experimentation is, the active experimentation, you go, okay, that's the experience, I'm going to try that thing, I'm going to try that thing, I'm going to try that thing, I'm going to try that thing. Whereas the concrete experience is, I'm just going to jump in and do it all. Right? So you can imagine, like, the easiest way for me is the difference between, say, going to tennis camp and then you practice serving. Right? That would be experimenting. And then you get a ball machine to hit a tennis ball to you and you practice returning serve. Right? And then you practice doing a drop shot, and then you experiment with each of the things you needed to do. Whereas the concrete experience person would say, right, let's start playing. I'll learn it as I do it. I'm not going to practice any individual component. I'm not going to experiment with the components and the parts of it. I'm going to throw myself into the whole experience. I'm going to, you see people like, I'm going to buy all the tennis clothes and the right gloves and the right headband and the right racket, and I'm going to throw myself into being a tennis player and all the things that a tennis player is, including trying to talk like a tennis player and have all the experience exactly like replicated as much as I can by throwing myself into it. Right? Now, sometimes you see this, I think, when people take up cycling. They'll buy all of the cycling equipment, the big bike, like the really high-end bike, and all the cycling shorts and the cycling bottles and the cycling bag, and they'll throw themselves into the full experience of cycling before they've actually even started actually training, right? They'll buy all the stuff to make the experience as cycling-like as possible.
Yeah, they think that this equipment makes them professionals. Yeah, it's like about kids and basketball, yeah?
Yeah, if you make your children play basketball, they'll get taller. So sometimes throwing yourself in the experience doesn't necessarily actually work. Right, so Kolb said there are people who prefer each of these styles, but also created this idea of there being a cycle. That's why you see this big loop around the outside. The idea that actually for a lot of experiences, we do go through these different phases, right? And like where you start might be your learning style, right? So the first time you come across a problem, which of these four do you kind of instantly go for when you come across something new? Which one? So who, the first time you come to a new experience, who starts watching things? Watching what other people do. Okay, we've got 3 or 4 people who do reflection watching. How many kind of start thinking kind of abstractly about the thing you're going to go and do? Okay, not many. None. Who wants to start experimenting with it? Okay, so we have 3 or 4 experimenters. and who just throws themselves into the experience wholeheartedly without doing any sort of prep work beforehand? Sometimes, yep. Okay, so so mostly we are observers and experimenters, right? So we're on the kind of the now this is the processing continuum. So we actually are kind of at both ends of that, and the perceptual continuum. Neither of you kind of first go there, but can you see how when you go through the reflection, what the people who start in the reflection watching, do you then go into the abstract to thinking about what you've been seeing? Could kind of see how that's kind of a progress. You start reflecting on what you're watching. Then do you start experimenting? Or do you just loop back to watching and thinking? Which ways do you guys go?
Or experimenting.
You
If I feel comfortable start.
Trying, then you might go into the experimenting.
Yeah.
Right. And do you then start throwing yourself into the experience, or do you go straight back to watching other people again? Do you kind of skip? It depends on how much you want to kind of involve yourself, I think, with that one. Right? But the idea of learning styles is that different people throw themselves into these different experiences, are more naturally gifted at one of them than the others. Right? So rather than say that you have a learning style and the only thing you can do is watch other people, right? Which doesn't really seem sensible. It's saying, you know, that's your natural inclination to start there and then cycle around these, right? And you might be better or worse at some steps, right? So for example, there are some people who might be really bad at abstract conceptualization, right? They can watch people do something and they can repeat that thing, but they can't generalize that into other things, right? So they might not be very good at that bit, right? So they might pass straight through it, not really doing any abstract conceptualization, and straight into experimenting. And maybe they're not good experimenters either, so they go straight through experimenting into I see what you're doing by the little clothes you're wearing and the bike you have. Right, so I'm going to skip through abstract thinking, I'm going to skip through experimenting, I'm going to go straight into feeling. Right? And then they cycle down saying, okay, I've got everything right. And I'm standing there, I'm out racing, and I watch the guy beside me and go, I see what you're doing. And then I miss the other two and go straight into experiment, like living the experience again, right? So they cycle in those top two areas because they're just not good at the other two. There are some people who might cycle in the bottom area, right? Where they do abstract thinking, they do an experiment, and then before actually trying that in the real world or watching what other people do, they go straight back into abstract thinking. Who might that be? Who might those people end up being? Researchers! University researchers can get caught in this bottom cycle, right? Because they experiment on something, and then instead of going through, like, does this work in real life when I become this thing? So software engineering is a classic one, right? They'll come up with a software engineering theory. They then don't actually live it. They don't try that in actual software development. They just come up with a theory. They don't then watch what the real industry are doing and then go straight back into abstract conceptualization, and then they cycle in the bottom corner. No? And so I think you could argue that these are equally disconnected from each other, right? There's a group who are just doing stuff in the top corner and the group thinking about stuff in the bottom corner. So potentially this idea of doing all of them, and when you identify when you're not good at something, finding someone who is good at that thing and working with them to complete the phases might be effective. So each of these arrows is given a term. So and if you're over in this area, so if you're in that middle ground, the accommodating is feeling and doing, which is the active experimentation and concrete. So that's the accommodating, feel and watch, diverging, think and do, converging, and think and watch, assimilating. Right? So we tried to give different terms for those different areas. Now, I don't really see why feel and watch is diverging. I don't think it's diverging, but I think I'd actually kind of see those phrases reworked and say that feeling and watching and feeling and watching and feeling is probably converging on doing what everyone else does. And thinking and abstractly experimenting, and then abstract thinking and experimenting, that's probably diverging away from reality, right? But maybe converging on the theoretical perfect result is what he thinks is happening in the bottom corner there, and diverging away from theory is what he means by the top corner. So, like, where that fits is different. But this is an idea that there are natural inclinations to do particular things well. So, if you look at the table, the converger, the diverger, the assimilator, and the accommodator, so he gives kind of approaches to each of these and gives characteristics. And training delivery mode is the idea that if you are in one of these areas, how we train you should fit with your learning style. Right? Now, that's the bit that's often debunked or argued against in modern education theory. Right? Is that potentially just helping you do what you're already good at isn't necessarily the most educational. Right? Because if you're in here, and I say, aha, in this sense, if you're in that converging active experiment and then thinking an active experiment, how I make you better is by just focusing you in on doing those things better. Right? Which might lead you to being even more distant academic who really doesn't care about the world. If I just focus on the things you're good at and make you do more of those. Right? So this idea that learning styles means that you train people in the way they're good at learning might not actually help them broaden and become better at learning in general. It might just reinforce their particular sub-area. Right? So you go, now, when we relate that back to games, this becomes interesting because when we give a group of people a range of games and they only ever play the games that they like playing and are good at, do they just get better and better at those particular subgroup of games because they never try other games? Right? Now, how many of you play FIFA? We have two. And a couple of people have tried it. Once or twice. Yeah. Now, there are some people who just don't play sports games. Right? And they don't, and they actually, one of the guys I know, Ernest Adams, he was working on the Madden series. Right? So he was a game developer working on the Madden series, doesn't like football. Right? Gridiron wasn't keen, didn't really find it interesting. Also, he doesn't like Twitch response games. He's a strategy game player, right? Because, he became a programmer and designer and designing structures, and, he thinks in a much more strategic, high-level area rather than Twitch skill controls. But he was designing a game and working on a game for Twitch skill controls, so he didn't really like playing the game that he was making because it required skills he didn't really have. Right? So, do we teach him, and do we try and teach him things only in the areas that he's good at? Or do you sometimes challenge people to try and get them into those other areas? Teach them in a different style that they're not as good at, but make them try doing that. So get a researcher to try doing it in the real world, or get someone who is just cycling in the real world without thinking to try reflecting on what they're doing. Right? To give them more of the whole experience. What do you think? Well, it depends. Yep. Unfortunately, that's a pretty easy answer. Well, if you look at this model, I don't know if you can read it very easily there. Not at all. And I don't know if I can zoom that up in this one. No. But so, for example, in the assimilator, which is the assimilator is watching other people and thinking about it, what they've done. It says the training mode should be prefer print-based delivery. So if you find that you are in this, you watch other people and then you think about it, apparently I'm supposed to give you handouts as the way you learn.
And then you animate them yourself, or what should we do?
So the diverger, they claim in the top corner, who throws himself into a thing and watches others, are traditional classroom-based delivery that comprises of brainstorming sessions, reflective activities, lectures, and rhetorical questions. I'm not sure that's what I would agree with. But, you know, so people tried to say, oh, these things mean we should deliver this in this style, right? So the accommodator likes experiments, so could use hands-on computer-based simulation games, online group work, role-playing games, and observations. They prefer computer-based delivery mode. Right, now, so the question is, should we test you, work out which of these you prefer, and then give you delivery solely on our assessment of what would be best for you? Could be cool to try with someone like assessing you and saying, right, you're a visual learner, so we're going to make everything visual for you. So that
How accurate the test would be?
this is a very specific challenge. How accurate can it be? So, and what do we mean by accurate? Right. So there's multiple ways of talking about accuracy. Can you think of why it could be very accurate but also inaccurate at the same time?
It could be different from course to course.
It could be different from course to course. Some of you were saying for maths, you were always in the blue, and so, you know, they never challenged you, right? So it could be that your mathematical learning style might actually be different to your linguistic learning style. When you're learning languages, maybe you need to be demonstrated things. But with maths, you can do experimentation. So if I test you on one learning style in one particular discipline, maybe it could be very accurate there, but not represent you in all the other areas. Right? Are you one style all the time? Could you ever change? Could it be that in some subjects you're one thing, another subject you're another? Or at different times. Right? Maybe sometimes, you know, as you get older, maybe you become more reflective and you start thinking, well, actually, no, I'm going to stop just doing stuff. I'm going to actually sit and think about stuff. Could you change? Is this determined once and for the rest of your life? So even if it was accurate once, it doesn't. So when you talk about accuracy, you can talk about temporal accuracy. Does it stay true over time? Or kind of range of behaviors. Does it stay true across different situations? And does it stay true for both of those, either over time and in different situations? So even, and you might even say, it's just not even accurate right now. For this thing, it's still not accurate. So, yeah. It's potentially very challenging. So, the Honey-Mumford model, and we'll just take a break in a minute. So the Honey-Mumford model talks about the stages of learning. So again, another model of how people learn. So Honey-Mumford model says that you have an experience, you review the experience, you conclude what you have from the experience, and then you plan the next step. Right? So this is just a standard planning cycle. And again, so using slightly different words, talking about people who are good at the different stages, right? So the activist is very good at having experiences. The reflector is very good at reviewing experiences and thinking about them. The theorist is good at taking those reflections and turning them into a generalized theory about the world. And the pragmatist is very good at planning the next stage. Now, ideally, you'd be good at all of these. But the learning models suggest that maybe there are people who are good at those activists, reflectors, theorists, and pragmatists. If you get someone with those learning styles, then what you can do is you take the Honey-Mumford model, you give it characteristics, and then you look at what actions those people are best at, right? So if we can, and we'll move quickly through until I can get to the next break. So Honey and Mumford versus Kolb and the Kolb one. Kolb style. So the bold is Kolb and the italics is Honey-Mumford. So basically, just like we did last week with saying that, you know, play styles, there are like tens of different people who have come up with different names for play styles. Right? Here we have another. Give us an axis. Put 4 categories. Put everybody into those 4 categories. Right? Now, if we're going to do an educational game, is it that it supports one of these more than others? Does that mean that there'll be particular kinds of people that we're benefiting by making an educational game? Should we target an educational game at everyone? So, where do you think, if we have a look at the activist, reflective, pragmatists and theorists, so I'll give you the quick, so they have a whole bunch of activities down here, which you again can't see particularly well, but brainstorming, problem solving, group discussion, puzzles, competitions and role play are all the activist. Right, so they've got role play. The reflector has things like stories and statistics. The theorist has case studies and problem solving, and the pragmatists have self-analysis questionnaires, personality questionnaires, timeout, observing activities, and observation, and feedback from others, and coaching. So, in this idea of there being concrete experience, reflective, conceptualization, and experimentation, where do you think games fit?
More in the activist side. We usually not asked to reflect that much.
In games, no. We usually don't ask you to reflect what you learned. We just try and get you to apply it again immediately. So, do you think that's probably something that games are just, we tend not to do well in games, is the reflection part?
Also, so like how do you actually engage players in reflecting upon that sort of stuff, because that's sort of quite vague.
So can you think of an area where that does happen in games?
Story parts. I know the Spec Ops Online has things where the designers said that there's no other NPCs around you after this situation and you're alone, just so that they should like try to promote you to think of what just happened.
Although they sort of made you reflect at the end, not during the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that also really made you think about what actually you actually did.
Right. So some games adding in reflective comments during the game or reflective at the end, which I know were both designed with that in mind. Where else might you find reflection and learning in that isn't necessarily built into the game?
Well, being built into the game, you also have to kill camps, etc. from FPSs.
Kill camps from FPSs are reflection built directly into the game, right? So this replay what just happened. But this idea of replay, right? Even some of what we mentioned before, playthroughs, right? Playthroughs give you the option of doing what area are playthroughs in that model. Observation. They're in the watching area, right? So playthroughs give you the ability to watch others, right? So in game they might not be in game, but in the community around the game, it supports that activity. Where might reflection happen if we start doing things outside of the game? Forums and discussion videos and the general community around a game. And now you see this, with people theorizing about movie trailers. When that trailer comes out and they spend lots of time analyzing frame by frame of trying to work out what's going to be in the movie and what it means, right? They're doing a lot of theorizing over top of the trailer. There are people who do that for games. They do a lot of theorizing. You can find people who have reverse engineered the tech tree and the numbers in a lot of the strategy games to work out what percentage each of these things and what values they add, and they're trying to reverse engineer the calculations going on to work out how it works. Right? All of that is in the theory and abstract area. So people do it. Not often is it built directly into the game, but it's in the community around the game. And so when we make an educational game, we might have to see it as a broader thing, right? How do we include that community to get all of these learning aspects? Now, I think we need to take a break. So, I'll take a break here, and we'll come back in 10 minutes at 25 past. Take a break. Go, and if you haven't done the questionnaire, you could go through on your computer and do a learning style questionnaire and see what learning style you are. Are you a learning style? I updated that link. It now downloads the PDF.
There is also a survey monkey for it, except it doesn't tell you the actual results.
Right.
It's really...
It just screams into the wild.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm guessing that I have like participated in a random survey somewhere.
You will have participated in a random survey somewhere. Yeah. Basically, I updated the link, and so I'll go to here. So now this Honey Mumford link downloads a PDF which has the learning styles, and those learning styles yes, so you go through and you try and work out which each of one of those means, and then it gives you you score 1 point for each item you ticked, and no points for items you put a cross on. Simply indicate in the list below which you ticked. And so the yeah, you guys can see that, but the stream can't. So the idea is that each question, if you agree with the question, makes you more activist, reflective, theorist, or pragmatist. And then it looks at the number of points you score and says whether or not you have a very strong preference, a strong preference, a moderate preference, a low preference, or a very low preference. Right? So the idea is you then, having worked this, you work out your numbers, you give yourself a plot in the each of the axes, and then that gives you the shape of your learning and what kind of learner you are. Yeah? So it is contentious to use that to then decide, right, we're going to, because you have the shape out towards being a theorist, we're going to change the way we teach our course to focus on theorists. Okay? It would be something we could do. Right? We could, if we measured everybody in the class, we could say, right, okay, so 90% of your theorists, 10% of your reflectors. Oh well, ignore the reflectors. We'll just do everything for the theorists because they're the most of the people in the class. So everything's going to be theory. Right? So that might be a bit harsh on the two people who aren't this similar to everyone else. But yeah, so go and have a break. I'll stop the stream and I'll put, and if you guys on the stream can go to Blackboard, you'll be able to get the link to the questionnaire. Okay, so I'll just go to the thing and talk to these guys. Is anybody here? There are 2 people watching. Okay. I said hello to them and they ignored me. Apparently me saying hello on the chat isn't good enough. But for people watching, we've got a 3rd one popped up. So doing these questionnaires and kind of understanding where it places you is one of 2 things. Either it confirms what you already know, or it might reveal something that you didn't expect. So in the break, think about what that would mean. Right? What would it mean for it to reveal something you didn't know about yourself? Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Go and take a walk.